The Inquisition is a group of institutions within the judicial system of the Catholic Church whose aim was to combat heresy. It started in 12th century France to combat religious sectarianism, in particular the Cathars and the Waldensians. Other groups which were investigated later include the Spiritual Franciscans, the Husites and Beguines. Beginning in the 1250s, inquisitors were generally chosen from members of the Dominican Order, to replace the earlier practice of using local clergy as judges. The term medieval Inquisition covers these courts up to mid-15th century. In the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the concept and scope of the Inquisition was significantly expanded in response to the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Its geographic scope was expanded to other European countries, resulting in the Spanish Inquisition and Portuguese Inquisition. Those two kingdoms in particular operated inquisitorial courts throughout the respective empires in the Americas, Asia and Africa. One particular focus of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions was the issue of Jewish atheism and Muslim converts to Catholicism, partly because these minority groups were more numerous in Spain and Portugal than in many other parts of Europe, and partly because they were often considered suspect due to the assumption that they had secretly reverted to the previous religions. Except within the Papal States, the institution of the Inquisition was abolished in the early 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and after the Spanish-American Wars of Independence in the Americas. The institution survived as part of the Roman Curia, but in 1904 was given the new name of Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office. In 1965 it became the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Definition and purpose. The term Inquisition comes from medieval Latin inquisitio, which referred to any court process that was based on Roman law, which had gradually come back into usage in the late medieval period. Today, the English term Inquisition can apply to any one of several institutions which worked against heretics within the judicial system of the Roman Catholic Church. Although the term Inquisition is usually applied to ecclesiastical courts of the Catholic Church, nonetheless it has several different usages. An ecclesiastical tribunal, the institution of the Catholic Church for combating heresy. A number of historical expurgation movements against heresy, or the trial of an individual accused of heresy. The Inquisition, as a church court, had no jurisdiction over Moors and Jews as such. Generally, the Inquisition was concerned only with the heretical behavior of Catholic adherents or converts. The overwhelming majority of sentences seem to have consisted of penances like wearing a cross sewn on one's clothes, going on pilgrimage, etc. When a suspect was convicted of unrepentant heresy, the inquisitorial tribunal was required by law to hand the person over to the secular authorities for final sentencing, at which point a magistrate would determine the penalty, which was usually burning at the stake, although the penalty varied based on local law. The laws were inclusive of prescriptions against certain religious crimes, and the punishments included death by burning, although imprisonment for life or banishment would usually be used. Thus the inquisitors generally knew what would be the fate of anyone so remanded, and cannot be considered to have divorced the means of determining guilt from its effects. The 1578 edition of the Directorium Inquisitorum spelled out the purpose of inquisitorial penalties. Quoniam punitio non refer to primo and amp pasce and correction eminam bonum eiusque punita, sed in bonum publicum ut alietarienter, and amp amalis committenda savicentur. Translation from the Latin, for punishment does not take place primarily and pasce for the correction and good of the person punished, but for the public good in order that others may become terrified and weaned away from the evils they would commit. Historical background. Before 1100, the Catholic Church had already suppressed what they believed to be heresy, usually through a system of ecclesiastical prescription or imprisonment, but without using torture and seldom resorting to executions. Such punishments had a number of ecclesiastical opponents, although some countries punished heresy with the death penalty. In the 12th century, to counter the spread of Catharism, prosecution of heretics became more frequent. The Church charged councils composed of bishops and archbishops with establishing inquisitions. The first Inquisition was temporarily established in Languedoc in 1184. The murder in 1208 of Pope Innocent's papal legate Pierre de Castelnau sparked the Albigensian Crusade. The Inquisition was permanently established in 1229. It was centered under the Dominicans in Rome and later at Carcassonne in Languedoc. Medieval Inquisition. Historians use the term medieval Inquisition to describe the various inquisitions that started around 1184, including the Episcopal Inquisition and later the Papal Inquisition. These inquisitions responded to large popular movements throughout Europe considered apostate or heretical to Christianity, in particular the Cathars in southern France and the Waldensians in both southern France and northern Italy. Other inquisitions followed after these first Inquisition movements. The legal basis for some inquisitorial activity came from Pope Innocent IV's papal bull Ad Extirpanda of 1252, which explicitly authorized the use of torture by the Inquisition for eliciting confessions from heretics. By 1256, inquisitors were given absolution if they used instruments of torture. In the 13th century, Pope Gregory IX assigned the duty of carrying out inquisitions to the Dominican Order and Franciscan Order. Most inquisitors were friars who taught theology and/or law in the universities. They used inquisitorial procedures, a common legal practice adapted from the earlier ancient Roman court procedures. They judged heresy along with bishops and groups of assessors, using the local authorities to establish a tribunal and to prosecute heretics. After 1200, a Grand Inquisitor headed each inquisition. Grand Inquisitions persisted until the mid-19th century. Early modern European history, with the sharpening of debate and of conflict between the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, Protestant societies came to use the Inquisition as a terrifying other, while staunch Catholics regarded the Holy Office as a necessary bulwark against the spread of reprehensible heresies. Witch trials. While belief in and persecution of witches were widespread in pre-Christian Europe, and reflected in Germanic law, the influence of the Church in the early medieval era resulted in the revocation of these laws in many places, bringing an end to traditional pagan witch hunts. Throughout the medieval era, mainstream Christian teaching had denied the existence of witches and witchcraft, condemning it as pagan superstition. However, Christian influence on popular beliefs in witches and maleficium failed to entirely eradicate folk belief in witches. The fierce denunciation and persecution of supposed sorceresses which characterized the cruel witch hunts of a later age were not generally found in the first 1300 years of the Christian era. The medieval Church distinguished between white and black magic. Local folk practice often mixed chants, incantations, and prayers to the appropriate patrons and to ward off storms, to protect cattle, or ensure a good harvest. Bonfires on Midsummer's Eve were intended to deflect natural catastrophes of the influence of fairies, ghosts, and witches. Plants, often harvested under particular conditions, were deemed effective in healing. Black magic was that which was used for a malevolent purpose. This was generally dealt with through confession, repentance, and charitable work assigned as penance. Early Irish canons treated sorcery as a crime to be visited with excommunication until adequate penance had been performed. In 1258, Pope Alexander IV ruled that inquisitors should limit their involvement to those cases in which there was some clear presumption of heretical belief. The prosecution of witchcraft generally became more prominent throughout the late medieval and Renaissance era, perhaps driven partly by the upheavals of the era, the Black Death, 100 Years' War, and a gradual cooling of the climate which modern scientists call the Little Ice Age. Witches were sometimes blamed. Dominican priest Heinrich Kramer was assistant to the Archbishop of Salzburg, and by 1474 was appointed inquisitor for the Tyrol, Salzburg, Bohemia and Moravia. In 1484 Kramer requested Pope Innocent VIII clarify his authority to prosecute witchcraft in Germany, where he had been refused assistance by the local ecclesiastical authorities, who maintained that as the letter of deputation did not specifically mention where the inquisitors may operate, they could not legally exercise the functions in their areas. The bull Summus Desiderans Effectibus sought to remedy this jurisdictional dispute by specifically identifying the dioceses of Mainz, Cologne, Trier, Salzburg, and Bremen. Innocent's bull enacted nothing new. Its direct purport was to ratify the powers already conferred upon Henry to deal with witchcraft as well as heresy, and it called upon the Bishop of Strasbourg to lend the inquisitors all possible support. Some scholars viewed the bull as clearly political, motivated by jurisdictional disputes between the local German Catholic priests and clerics from the office of the Inquisition who answered more directly to the Pope. The bull failed to ensure that Kramer obtained the support he had hoped for, causing him to retire and to compile his views on witchcraft in his book Malleus Maleficarum, which was written in 1486. In the book, Kramer stated his view that witchcraft was to blame for bad weather. It is also noted for its animuses against women. In 1538, the Spanish Inquisition cautioned its members not to believe everything the Malleus said, even when it presented apparently firm evidence. Spanish Inquisition Portugal and Spain in the late Middle Ages consisted largely of multicultural territories of Muslim and Jewish influence, reconquered from Islamic control, and the new Christian authorities could not assume that all their subjects would suddenly become and remain Orthodox Roman Catholics. So the Inquisition in Iberia, in the lands of the Reconquista counties and kingdoms like Leon, Castile and Aragon, had special socio-political basis as well as more fundamental religious motives. In some parts of Spain towards the end of the 14th century, there was a wave of violent anti-Judaism, encouraged by the preaching of Ferran Martínez, Archdeacon of Echia. In the pogroms of June 1391 in Seville, hundreds of Jews were killed, and the synagogue was completely destroyed. The number of people killed was also high in other cities, such as Córdoba, Valencia and Barcelona. One of the consequences of these pogroms was the mass conversion of thousands of surviving Jews. Forced baptism was contrary to the law of the Catholic Church, and theoretically anybody who had been forcibly baptized could legally return to Judaism. However, this was very narrowly interpreted. Legal definitions of the time theoretically acknowledged that a forced baptism was not a valid sacrament, but confined this to cases where it was literally administered by physical force. A person who had consented to baptism under threat of death or serious injury was still regarded as a voluntary convert, and accordingly forbidden to revert to Judaism. After the public violence, many of the converted felt it safer to remain in the new religion. Thus, after 1391, a new social group appeared and were referred to as conversos or New Christians. King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabel I of Castile established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. In contrast to the previous Inquisitions, it operated completely under royal Christian authority, though staffed by clergy and orders, and independently of the Holy See. It operated in Spain and in all Spanish colonies and territories, which included the Canary Islands, the Spanish Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, and all Spanish possessions in North, Central, and South America. It primarily targeted forced converts from Islam and from Judaism. Both groups still resided in Spain after the end of the Islamic control of Spain, who came under suspicion of either continuing to adhere to their old religion or of having fallen back into it. In 1492, all Jews who had not converted were expelled from Spain. Those who converted became subject to the Inquisition. Inquisition in the Spanish Overseas Empire in the Americas. King Philip II set up 3 tribunals in 1569, one in Mexico, Cartagena de Indias and Peru. The Mexican office administered Mexico, Nueva Galicia, the Audiencias of Guatemala, and the Spanish East Indies. The Peruvian Inquisition, based in Lima, administered all the Spanish territories in South America and Panama. Portuguese Inquisition. The Portuguese Inquisition formally started in Portugal in 1536 at the request of the King of Portugal, João III. Manuel I had asked Pope Leo X for the installation of the Inquisition in 1515, but only after his death did Pope Paul III acquiesce. At its head stood a Grande Inquisidor, or General Inquisitor, named by the Pope but selected by the Crown, and always from within the royal family. The Portuguese Inquisition principally targeted the Sephardic Jews, whom the state forced to convert to Christianity. Spain had expelled its Sephardic population in 1492. After 1492, many of these Spanish Jews left Spain for Portugal, but eventually were targeted there as well. The Portuguese Inquisition held its first auto da fe ocult in 1540. The Portuguese inquisitors mostly targeted the Jewish New Christians. The Portuguese Inquisition expanded its scope of operations from Portugal to Portugal's colonial possessions, including Brazil, Cape Verde, and Goa, where it continued as a religious court, investigating and trying cases of breaches of the tenets of Orthodox Roman Catholicism until 1821. King João III extended the activity of the courts to cover censorship, divination, witchcraft and bigamy. Originally oriented for a religious action, the Inquisition exerted an influence over almost every aspect of Portuguese society, political, cultural and social. The Goa Inquisition, an inquisition largely aimed at Catholic converts from Hinduism or Islam who were thought to have returned to their original ways, started in Goa in 1560. In addition, the Inquisition prosecuted non-converts who broke prohibitions against the observance of Hindu and Muslim rites or interfered with Portuguese attempts to convert non-Christians to Catholicism. Alexo Diaz Falco and Francisco Marques set it up in the palace of the Sarbayo Adil Khan. According to Henry Charles Lee, between 1540 and 1794, tribunals in Lisbon, Porto, Coimbra and Evora resulted in the burning of 1,175 persons, the burning of another 633 in effigy, and the penancing of 29,590. But documentation of 15 out of 689 autos da fe ocult has disappeared. so these numbers may slightly understate the activity. Roman Inquisition. With the Protestant Reformation, Catholic authorities became much more ready to suspect heresy in any new ideas, including those of Renaissance humanism, previously strongly supported by many at the top of the church hierarchy. The extirpation of heretics became a much broader and more complex enterprise, complicated by the politics of territorial Protestant powers, especially in Northern Europe. The Catholic Church could no longer exercise direct influence in the politics and justice systems of lands which officially adopted Protestantism. Thus, war, massacre, and the missional and propaganda work of the Counter-Reformation came to play larger roles in these circumstances, and the Roman law type of a judicial approach to heresy represented by the Inquisition became less important overall. In 1542, Pope Paul III established the Congregation of the Holy Office of the Inquisition as a permanent congregation staffed with cardinals and other officials. It had the tasks of maintaining and defending the integrity of the faith and of examining and prescribing errors and false doctrines. It thus became the supervisory body of local inquisitions. Arguably the most famous case tried by the Roman Inquisition involved Galileo Galilei in 1633. The penances and sentences for those who confessed or were found guilty were pronounced together in a public ceremony at the end of all the processes. This was the Summa Generalis or Auto da Refiocute. Penances might consist of a pilgrimage, a public scourging, a fine, or the wearing of a cross. The wearing of 2 tongues of red or other brightly colored cloth, sewn onto an outer garment in an ex patin, marked those who were under investigation. The penalties in serious cases were confiscation of property to the Inquisition or imprisonment. This led to the possibility of false charges over confiscation with those over a certain income, particularly rich Miranos. Following the French invasion of 1798, the new authorities sent 3,000 chests containing over 100,000 Inquisition documents to France from Rome. Ending of the Inquisition in the 19th and 20th centuries. The wars of independence of the former Spanish colonies in the Americas concluded with the abolition of the Inquisition in every quarter of Hispanic America between 1813 and 1825. In Portugal, in the wake of the Liberal Revolution of 1820, the General Extraordinary and Constituent Courts of the Portuguese nation abolished the Portuguese Inquisition in 1821. The last execution of the Inquisition was in Spain in 1826. This was the execution by garroting of the schoolteacher Cayetano Ripoll for purportedly teaching deism in his school. In Spain, the practices of the Inquisition were finally outlawed in 1834. In Italy, after the restoration of the Pope as the ruler of the Papal States in 1814, the activity of the Papal States Inquisition continued on until the mid-19th century, notably in the well-publicized Mortara affair. In 1908, the name of the congregation became the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, which in 1965 further changed to Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, as retained to the present day. Statistics. Beginning in the 19th century, historians have gradually compiled statistics drawn from the surviving court records, from which estimates have been calculated by adjusting the recorded number of convictions by the average rate of document loss for each time period. Gustav Henningsen and Jamie Contreras studied the records of the Spanish Inquisition, which lists 44,674 cases, of which 826 resulted in executions in person and 778 in effigy. William Monter estimated there were 1,000 executions between 1530 to 1630 and 250 between 1630 to 1730. Jean-Pierre Dedieu studied the records of Toledo's tribunal, which put 12,000 people on trial. For the period prior to 1530, Henry Carman estimated there were about 2,000 executions in all of Spain's tribunals. Italian Renaissance history professor and Inquisition expert Carlo Ginzburg had his doubts about using statistics to reach a judgment about the period. In many cases, we don't have the evidence has been lost, said Ginzburg. Appearance in popular media. Series 2 Episode 2 of Monty Python's Flying Circus is entitled The Spanish Inquisition, and features Michael Palin, Terry Jones, and Terry Gilliam as an inept, not to mention anachronistic team of inquisitors attempting to menace 20th-century Britons, who seem unfazed by their inane torture implements and woefully unpolished theatrics. The signature gimmick is bursting into the room whenever someone says they didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition, and declaring that nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, a line which has itself inspired numerous homages and parodies since. The 1982 novel Baltazar and Blimunda by José Saramago portrays how the Portuguese Inquisition impacts the fortunes of the title characters as well as several others from history, including the priest and aviation pioneer Bartolomeu de Gusmão. The 1981 comedy film History of the World, Part 1, produced and directed by Mel Brooks, features a segment on the Spanish Inquisition. Inquisitio is a French television series set in the Middle Ages. In the novel Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, there is some discussion about various sects of Christianity and Inquisition, a small discussion about the ethics and purpose of Inquisition, and a scene of Inquisition